Okay, I am so excited for this episode.
Me too.
I'm not gonna lie. You found today's protagonist. I had never heard of him, and I was fascinated. I was excited to learn more, and those are my favorite ones where I have to do, a lot of research. I was able to find a book, which is even more exciting because that's not always the case with the people that we cover. And
Did you have to do an interlibrary loan?
I went to the library.
No, but
And yes, interlibrary from another library, and it brought it over to my library.
She is the real deal.
Yeah, it was very exciting. It's all very exciting. Like a real historian.
I bet the librarians were really excited to be part of that.
I'm sure that they were, because as soon as I walked in, I said, I have a book on hold. They're like, it's on the wall. And I was like, okay, I'll get it myself, I guess. You didn't deliver it to me on a platter. But anyway, and also given the time of year, we are headed into Thanksgiving.
Yes, we are. And this should be released the week of Thanksgiving. So
yes, if all goes to plan.
I had some lasagna soup. I'm drinking hot cocoa.
Oh,
it's fall.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Is it fall or Christmas?
Why would that be Christmas?
I don't know. I guess hot cocoa, I think of I guess it could be fall. It's 50 degrees here, so that counts.
Fall. It's like 70 here, but that's fall.
Yeah, who cares? But given that it's a Thanksgiving holiday and the narrative that Americans love to push about how the settlers, the colonists, came to America and bonded with the Native Americans and shared food and hospitality, we wanted to basically just come and blow all of that up and give you the real
as your favorite potentially Disney film.
Yeah,
with
we're going to upset a lot of people who probably thought a lot of things were true their whole life. I know when I learned some things about Pocahontas, for example, growing up, because we actually grew up near Jamestown. So this story is actually even more exciting because we were around this physical area when we were younger. So
I feel like I've already told this story on the podcast, but in 4th grade, my class did a trip to Jamestown, and we were there for the 450th anniversary, the same day that Queen Elizabeth visited. However,
I don't remember if you've told that, but that is a great story.
We were not allowed to be on the premises at the same time as Queen Elizabeth, so we went to a museum nearby, an art museum, and saw a famous portrait of Pocahontas that, if you ever look up,
is it the one of her? Well, I won't say because that would give away. Yes, okay.
I feel like we all should disclose something though at the start of this.
Okay,
we should disclose our connection to the Pilgrims, as long as we're talking about Thanksgiving and colonial native interactions.
You mean the Mayflower?
Yeah.
Yes. Our mother's ancestors did come over on the Mayflower.
Not just they didn't just come over. Her ancestor is William Bradford, who was the mayor of Plymouth. So
yes. Okay. So I was trying not to brag.
No, I mean, is that a brag, or should we be canceled?
I guess that's, well, you can decide after hearing today's podcast. Yes. Probably canceled. Yeah. So yes, very excited. And but before we get started, we wanted to chat a little bit about the different medias where you can find us these days.
Yeah, we've been booked and busy, so just want to make sure everyone knows where to find us. You can still find us on our original website, uneasy-lies-the-crown.com. But we also decided to move on over to Substack, which we're really excited about. It's a great platform, and we're taking some of the original uh, people that we covered and the series that we did and condensing them. I think we've learned a lot since then, so it should be better to read and also incorporates the podcast episodes that we later recorded about these different people. So definitely go check it out and subscribe. That's ultc.substack.com. And then obviously, if you're listening to this, you know where to find us for the podcast. You can also watch along on YouTube. And then for
And TikTok.
social media, yeah, you can watch us on TikTok and on X, formerly known as Twitter. I don't know when we can stop saying the formerly known.
I will never say X.
Okay.
You heard it here right now. I will never say it.
Okay.
I have to put my foot down for something in life, and that's what I choose.
You're so brave.
Thank you. Just like my ancestors when they came and conquered the New World.
You got it from William Bradford.
I did. Thanks, Will. Okay, so thank you for that plug. I want to start with a little game of true or false.
Oh, okay.
To give a little preview of who we're going to be talking about and the time period. So we're going to go back to the 1600s today. We are in Jamestown in Virginia. If you don't know where that is, read a book. I'll look it up. It's on the coast of Virginia, Chesapeake Bay. So first true or false is Jamestown was a prosperous colony because of its location and natural resources.
I'm going to go with true.
You would think so. It actually is kind of false. It failed and almost failed completely several times.
Oh, wow.
In the first several decades of when the English came over, because of this, mostly because of starvation. They didn't have food, and they didn't know how to cultivate the land. So we'll talk more about that, how that came into play with the Native Americans who already lived there. But I was actually fascinated to know like how close they came to having like to either being completely wiped out or having to leave altogether and abandon the land. So didn't have a Jamestown that we know today. Okay, true or false? Pocahontas's real name was not Pocahontas.
I think that's true.
That is true. That was a name that she had as a child.
Like a nickname?
It means little playful one. So yes, yes, kind of like a child's name. Her real name was Mataoka, I'm guessing.
And why did the
Matoaka.
Pocahontas end up sticking in history?
Most likely because the English or the Europeans are the ones that wrote down this history. And that was her name when they met her. And they also didn't want to give away their given name or like her given name. So that's how she introduced her. It's how they referred to her. Was by this nickname. And that kind of leads to the next one. Pocahontas and John Smith had a relationship. Romantic.
That's false.
False.
It was a different John.
Yes. Also, she was a child when they met. She was like between
that hasn't stopped many people.
Good point. History. Well, thankfully it stopped John Smith. He was real. They were not romantically involved. But they did know each other. And again, we're going to talk more about how they were connected. But you're right. She was actually romantically involved and married to another John. His name was John Rolfe. They met when Pocahontas was kidnapped by the English, and she was brought back to Jamestown. And she decided to actually stay with the English, and she was given the English name Rebecca and then she married John Rolfe.
Hmm.
So that the John Smith
Less of a good
narrative,
story than Colors of the Wind.
it is less of a good story. But true or false, Pocahontas really did throw herself over John Smith to prevent her father from executing him. This is a very famous scene in the movie, if you remember.
I'm gonna go with true.
It is true. But yes, but historians think it was really like a symbolic gesture during like a ceremony
Okay.
with the Native Americans, and they were kind of like they're bringing him into the tribe and accepting him, and that was like some type of symbolic gesture. Again, she was
Like
like
he was
10 or
never
12.
going to be killed.
Correct. Yes. But there are many reports that do have her throwing herself over John Smith. And she was the chief's daughter, so that was why she was involved. So a little bit of truth there. True or false, Pocahontas traveled to England as portrayed in Pocahontas 2, Journey to a New World.
That's true. And she
That
died
was the
there.
portrait you were referring to?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And then, yes, she sadly died when she was there. Actually, she died on her way back. She was coming back. But yes, I think it's believed she died from tuberculosis. She was still very young. And she was quite popular when she was in England. Um, I don't really remember much from Pocahontas 2, but I just kind of think about it now, and it's a little bit creepy to me.
It is weird. I mean, it's kind of like Anastasia.
Mm.
That although we loved it as a child, like the portrayal of Rasputin, it is just odd, like why they did that
Right.
with a real person and
Right.
story.
Yep.
In a children's movie.
Yes, specifically in a children's. Knowing how susceptible children are, and like we said, we grew up thinking that this whole narrative, Pocahontas and John Smith, was fact.
Yeah.
Okay, last one. John Smith had his compass stolen by a raccoon.
How would any I don't know. False.
It is false, but he did have a compass that was important to his story because it helped when he was kidnapped and brought to the Powhatan chief.
Okay.
It was something that he used to like barter for his life because they thought it was very fascinating. So I just wanted to bring that up because in Pocahontas, Miko takes the compass and he snatches it and he's trying to eat it. I always thought that was really cute. But he did actually have a compass. So
Okay. By the way, every time you say Powhatan, I'm triggered because in 4th grade when we were learning about Virginia history, we had to learn many songs about Virginia history, and there's one about the Powhatan tribe that to this day lives rent-free in my head.
is it historically accurate?
Yeah, I think it was just like a song to teach us where different tribes lived in Virginia. Like
Do you
geographically.
remember it? Can you sing it? You have to now. I'm always the one that sings. Come on, I've never heard this. I skipped this part in we were living in Rhode Island during this time. They didn't have this song.
In Tidewater land, home to Powhatan, Algonquin speaking clan. In Tidewater land, the first Americans lived on the land. Indians, the first Americans. It's pretty good.
And that is true. That is historically accurate. They did. Their language was Algonquian.
An effective learning tool that I still remember that.
I mean, that was a long time ago, and you remember it. So, yeah. Props to the teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so thank you for the true and false. We're warmed up now, and hopefully our listeners have learned something. If they don't get past the first 10 minutes of this, I feel like I've taught them something. Yeah. But the man of the hour is a Native American chief who was part of the Powhatans, and his name was Chief Opechancanough. And you and I have been really practicing that because I thought about giving him a nickname, but then we thought, no, we need to honor his his name. So be patient with me because I'm going to have to say it a lot during this episode, but hopefully I've practiced enough.
Sounds
I
great.
do want to start, though, with a note about some of the historical debate around Opechancanough, because as we go through the story, you're going to see that he lived many different lives. He had several different names depending on the people that he was with at that time, the names that they gave him. And so there is some debate about whether this person was the same person that we're going to talk about. We are going off the assumption that it is the same person for this episode. I think there is a lot of convincing evidence. I read a great book by James Horn called A Brave and Cunning Prince. It is all about Opechancanough, and he also does take the stance that this person is the same. So I'm going to introduce the other names that he went by, but I'm just going to introduce it and then still continue to refer to him by Opechancanough because I just want it to remain not confusing for our listeners. But any questions about that? Anything else I should clarify? I think the other thing I want to clarify is that all of the accounts that we have of Opechancanough and really of the Native Americans at this time, specifically about the Powhatan people, are from Europeans.
Okay.
And what they wrote down, because the Powhatan people did not, as I understand it, write down their history. Their history was told through stories.
Mm.
So so what we have to go off of is our writings from the English, and then we're talking about Spanish as well. So
Okay.
I just wanted to note that. Doesn't mean they're not true, but as with all stories where you have kind of like, what do they say? Like the history is written by the winners or something like that. That's what we have to go up. So, all right, we're going to start in the Chesapeake Bay area in 1561, where Opechancanough, who was at this time, we understand it, known by another name. That name is Pocahontas. He is a younger teenager at the time, and he is actually kidnapped by the Spanish. So they had landed in that area. They met him. This unfortunately happened a lot, where they would kidnap natives. They would bring them back to learn from them, to try to influence them. And that is what the Spanish were doing. Again, there's some debate about whether he went with them willingly or whether they took him by force. I personally am going to believe that they took him because that's usually what happened. And from what the Spanish believed, he was, quote, royal. So most likely the son of a chief or the relative of a chief. So that was an extra incentive for them to take him because they knew that he had influence with people. So they take him all the way to Spain, which that's like I think it was 2-month journey by boat. It's very far and it's completely different way of life, language, everything. So they take Opechancanough to, also known as Pocahontas, to Spain, and he meets King Philip II.
Oh, wow.
Which is fascinating to me and might be to our loyal listeners because he's actually the grandson of one of our other subjects, Juana of Castile. So if you want to learn more about her, isn't that crazy?
What a small world.
If you want to learn more about her, we do have an episode called Living La Juana Loca. Sorry, I don't even know our own episodes. That's very fascinating. So this is her grandson. And Philip is interested in meeting Opechancanough because Of course, the Spanish want to conquer this new world, so they wanted to learn from him. And they also really felt like it was their duty to convert the native people to Catholicism. So in his mind, if he could get Opechancanough to convert to Catholicism and return him back home, he could influence the people, they would convert and be one big happy family, basically. So before they went back to the Virginia area, Opechancanough and some others went to what we know as Mexico now. I think they called it New Spain back then. And he became deathly ill. He was actually able to survive the illness. It was possibly smallpox or measles. Incredible for what he's been through. He was, in Spain. Now he's in another country. He did recover. And as a result of this recovery, he tells the Spanish that he's with that he wants to convert to Catholicism, that like he's had this kind of like this change of heart because he survived. They see it as like a miracle. So they're feeling really good about him. And they decide we're going to go back to Virginia. We're going to take him back. Well,
so sorry, how long total was he gone for? Like in Spain?
I will tell you because so they try to go to Virginia and they don't make it. They were blown off course. And then they try again and they still can't make it. So the captain of the ship says, you know what, we're just going to go back to Spain. So instead of going back to Florida where they had colonies or back to Mexico, they go all the way back to Spain. And then they call them all the way back to like the Florida, Mexico area. Before they finally do make it back. I mean, I have this recurring nightmare where I can't get to where I'm going because something is preventing me, like something small. This was actually
that later.
Yes, we'll dive into that. But this was actually Opechancoough's reality. He was right there.
Yeah.
And then and then he wasn't. So all in all, before he actually did return home, it was 9 years.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So he's much older. He has learned Spanish. He has, learned European ways of life.
He's like in his 20s now?
Yes, we think. Yeah, if we had to guess. Or early 20s. Okay. So they make it finally. He is there with a group of Jesuit companions who are there to kind of help him in this conversion process. But what they didn't see coming was what happened, which is that Opechancanough turns on them and with a group of Native Americans murders everyone that he rides with.
Oh my gosh.
So he kills everyone. The only survivor was a younger child who was able to escape. And that's how we know these details, because that was an eyewitness.
So what do people think that his willingness to convert in the first place was a ruse to be able to get back to Virginia?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. It was all a clever ruse. He won their trust. He knew he wanted to get home. He was apparently an incredible actor. And he got there and they felt settled, and then he killed them. Yes. So Opechancanough gets rid of the Spanish. So him and the Powhatans, which is the tribe or the chiefdom that he is a part of, that he was a part of before he was taken, they are like, great, now the Spanish are gone. Maybe they'll come back and retaliate, maybe not. And then they end up not. So they feel pretty good about that. But a new enemy or neighbor was coming, and we know that to be the English. So also of note, the Spanish and English at this time were also enemies. So they are both in competition for the New World. They both want to spread their religion. In England's case, it was Protestant. They were Protestants, and Anglicanism specifically. And if you want to learn more about why Spain was Catholic and why England is Protestant, you can check out our Henry VIII episode, because it does talk a little bit more about that. So they have similar goals, but they're obviously, in a power struggle for the New World and the resources that they believe the New World has. So now I want to introduce the man that you may know. This is Pocahontas's father, Chief Powhatan. So again, his name, he goes by Chief Powhatan, but the name of the Native American people, the tribes, or the chiefdom, I should say, is the Powhatans. And then there's tribes underneath them, smaller tribes that make up the Powhatan people. There are about 30, a little over 30 tribes. So Opechancanough was Powhatan's war chief. And he was also a chief of one of the smaller tribes underneath the Powhatans, and they were known as the Pamunkeys or Pamunkes. So, it's also thought that Opechancanough was related to Powhatan in some way. We're not sure if he was a brother or half brother of Powhatan, in which case he would be Pocahontas's uncle.
I saw that come up when I was researching him, that people refer to him as like Pocahontas's uncle.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's one of the common theories. He was definitely related to him and Pocahontas in some way. And that goes back to when he was kidnapped and they were referring to him as some type of royal. Like, that would make sense because he was clearly related to a chief or multiple chiefs at the time. So we have Chief Powhatan, and now we have the English. And with the English is our friend John Smith, who we all know. And John Smith and Chief Powhatan, did actually know each other. They actually worked together. They had a pretty agreeable relationship at first. When I was mentioning how Pocahontas threw herself over John Smith during that ceremony, again, that was like a kind of a welcoming ceremony. And that was because the English desperately needed food. So they needed corn. They needed that to get through the winters. And the Native Americans were the only ones that could supply that. And then on the other hand, the Native Americans, specifically Chief Powhatan, wanted English weapons. So muskets, swords, cannons. They could see the writing on the wall. Yeah. And they knew that they were not going to be able to survive long term if they didn't have these types of weapons to defend themselves in the future. So that was kind of their relationship for a while. Not surprisingly, the relationship did go left several times because each side had their own idea of what they wanted the relationship to be. There was a power struggle, not surprisingly. And John Smith actually escaped 2 separate capture attempts by Powhatan and Opechancanough. Part of the reason why I thought this was fascinating, part of the reason why the English settlers and the government and the king back home didn't like Opechancanough and the Powhatans was because they believed that Opechancanough had led an assault on the survivors of Roanoke. So, yeah, if you're familiar with this long lost colony of Roanoke,
fascinating.
It was an English colony. I forget how many there were, maybe 70, 100. There were a good amount of people who just disappeared off the face of the earth. And the only thing that was left was a carving on the tree. It said Croatoa, I believe. People still don't know what it means. The thought is that they assimilated with the Native Americans because they were trying to survive. And they ended up, marrying into the tribes and having children. And so the thought was that Opechancanough hunted down these survivors and killed them. So,
Whoa.
again, don't know if it's true, but his name comes up in that debate.
And it shows that, like, his reputation was known for England to know
Exactly.
about him. He's a heavy hitter, even though he's not chief of the
Exactly.
entire kingdom.
Right. So they know this guy's the war chief. They know he's close to Chief Powhatan, and they know that he is ruthless if he, when he wants to be. So, basically, Powhatan, Opechancanough, the Powhatans, they go to war against Jamestown, and that was where I was talking about. Like Jamestown was almost wiped off the map several times because of these wars, and the Powhatans would starve them out. Basically, they would burn their crops, burn their homes, steal their weapons, so they didn't have anything to survive with. Eventually, they did come to a peaceful time period of about 5 to 6 years. And then around 1616, there seems to be a power shift. So Chief Powhatan, he's getting older. And Opechancanough, as you mentioned, is getting a reputation for being influential and very powerful. And Opechancanough is also starting to build an alliance with the English of his own. So he's getting buddy-buddy with them. And then in 1618, Chief Powhatan dies, and another one of his brothers succeeds him as chief of the Powhatans.
Okay.
But at this point, the English really see Opechancanough as the one with power. He's the one that they are afraid of. A few years after that, Opechancanough finally gives the English colonists at Jamestown what they've been looking for, and that is, he says he's going to convert to the Protestant religion, and his people are going to convert as well. So they are overjoyed.
One before.
Sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
And this is, again, another reason why there's a very strong argument that this is the same person. It's very similar.
It's like the same
very
ruse.
similar tactics that we're about to see. So the English, they're excited. This confirms the Native Americans' loyalty and trustworthiness. They can all live together. And then in March of that year, Opechancanough launches a surprise attack against the English settlements in the area and kills 350 settlers, men, women, children. Does not matter. That it was basically a bloodbath. So again, we saw that pattern. Very good at giving them what they wanted to hear, and then had this plan of attack. So of course, there's retribution. There's always going to be. Opechancanough and his brother Itoyatin, they're poisoned by the English. So the English, they have this meal or meeting or whatever, and they poison the chiefs, and then they believe that the chiefs are dead. Neither of them are dead, as they find out. But Opechancanough does disappear for about 7 years. So when he returns, obviously he is older. There's a lot that's been happening. And towards the end of his life, I'm going to read this quote about how he appeared towards the end of his life. This is a quote from the book I read, and the quote's from Robert Beverly. Opechancanough, by his great age and the fatigues of war, was now grown so decrepit that he was not able to walk alone, but was carried about by his men wherever he had a mind to move. His flesh was all macerated, his sinews slackened, and his eyelids became so heavy that he could not see, but as they were lifted up by his servants. So that is how we find Opechancanough towards the end of his life when he was older. And now we're going to talk about the theory that we have about what was happening in that 7-year disappearance, and what may have led to kind of the decline of his health towards the end of his life.
Yeah, so like you said, he's obviously older. At this point, he would be around 70. Is that correct?
What
After his 7-year disappearance.
Yeah, 1622. What did we I mean, this is the amazing thing. Like, all this stuff has happened in his life, and he's still, so 1561, 4, 5, yeah, about 70.
70, yeah.
70.
So he is about 70. Obviously, 70 is very old for the 1600s. But at the same time, there are things about this description that definitely stand out and have stood out to medical historians for a long time. In 1988, there was a paper published in JAMA Neurology by Dr. H. Blair Marsteller is her name. And it argued that Opechancanough is actually the first case recorded by history or in history of a disease called myasthenia gravis. And I will go into a bit of the science, but just to give you some background, myasthenia gravis, the name actually comes from words from Greek and Latin, meaning severe muscle weakness.
Mm-hmm.
So it is affecting any muscles in the body that can be controlled. So not things like your intestinal muscle contractions that are just happening kind of automatically in the background, but literally anything else can be affected. And most commonly affected, we'll discuss why, would be muscles in the face, the throat, the neck, and limbs, and the eyes actually as well. And this
Which
leads
lines
to
up to that description of
exactly the having to have his attendants lift up his eyes is really like the big clue that we're talking about myasthenia gravis, because that's such a hallmark symptom. So with those parts of the body being affected, you can imagine there's difficulty walking, keeping your eyes open, which is called ptosis when you have drooping of the eyelids, difficulty speaking and eating and breathing. So actually the biggest risk for death with myasthenia gravis, while the symptoms worsen over time, is that you'll have an attack where you can't actually breathe because of the muscle weakness. And another hallmark is that these symptoms can get better with rest. So typically at the beginning of the day, someone with myasthenia gravis, their muscle strength will be a little bit better. And then when they get fatigued as the day goes on, it gets worse. Hopefully that'll make sense once I describe what is actually driving the disease. But there are accounts when he was imprisoned by the British that after resting, he was able to do things like stand up that, like in this account, he's not able to do. He's carried everywhere. So that's another big one, is that you not only have to have the muscle weakness, but it has to get better with rest. And it usually involves the face and the eyelids. To give you an idea of the prevalence, it's estimated that about 37,000, or 37 in 100,000 Americans suffers from myasthenia gravis. Those numbers are from 2021. But these prevalence rates have been increasing over time. It's pretty equal between men and women, but interestingly, the age of onset is different. So women tend to be diagnosed with myasthenia gravis before the age of 40, where men are closer to 60 and up. So that makes sense with, we see after the 7-year period, Opechancanough is now in his 70s and exhibiting symptoms.
So it's half the age for women.
Yeah.
Give or take. That's interesting.
Which is really interesting. And we can talk a little bit more once we know the biology about, not necessarily why, I don't have an answer for why that is, but why it's especially interesting given the type of disease that myasthenia gravis is. So it was first described, the first case, in 1672 by Dr. Thomas Willis. So this is decades after the accounts of Opechancanough, which is why Opechancanough is a big deal in the medical field, because they really do believe that this was the first case we have recorded. So even though it was first officially described in the 1600s, it took many, many years for the field to actually understand what was causing the muscle weakness. So I'll just highlight like a couple of key developments. The first didn't even come until the 1930s, where a physician named Mary Walker, she noted that myasthenia gravis symptoms are similar to symptoms of people who have been poisoned with something called curare. And curare is a plant extract that's found in South and Central America, and it's been used by indigenous populations there. They put it on the end of arrows and then use that as like a poisonous arrow. And this causes paralysis. So it was known how curare works because there was a successful treatment, which is a drug called, or a type of compound called an acetylcholine esterase inhibitor. So let's talk about what's actually going on there. To zoom out, we'll talk about how the brain and muscles actually communicate. So we all know that your brain can control movements, but how exactly is that? I think in the past, we've talked about how neurons or your cells in the brain communicate with each other. Just as an overview, if you have a neuron, it becomes electrically excited when it receives a signal, and it transmits that electrical signal across the cell, and then it reaches the synapse, which is the point where two cells are connected. And if that electrical signal gets all the way there, the excited cell will release a chemical signal that can be received by the next cell, which will cause electrical excitability, and so on and so forth. But I think what a lot of people don't know is that a very similar connection is made between neurons and muscles. And this is called a neuromuscular junction. So basically, neurons that start in your brainstem, they travel all the way down the spinal cord, and then they go out into nerves, and then they form connections with muscles at a part of the muscle called the end plate. And when these neurons release chemical signals, in this case, it's with a chemical called acetylcholine. And then the muscle has receptors for acetylcholine receptors. And acetylcholine will bind the receptor, and that actually causes electrical activity in the muscle, which will cause it to contract. So the reason why curare comes into play is that curare is known to inhibit acetylcholine receptors. It basically binds and blocks acetylcholine from binding and exciting the muscle. So you get the paralysis. So the Dr. Mary Walker then took the cure antidote for curare, gave it to patients with myasthenia gravis, and saw that their symptoms got better. So this was the first clue that, okay, myasthenia gravis has something to do with acetylcholine signaling between neurons and muscles.
This was in the 30s, 1930s?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So we're talking like 300 years after Opechancanough.
Too late.
Too little too late. But it wasn't clear like why there's this dysfunction. And that came a little bit later. Dr. Alfred Blaylock, he's a very famous physician from Johns Hopkins University, actually. And he kind of gave the first evidence that this might have something to do with the immune system. He had a patient with myasthenia gravis who also happened to have a tumor on their thymus. And the thymus is a gland where T cells develop, which are important cells in your immune system. So he had to remove the tumor, and he found that after that, the patient's myasthenia gravis symptoms were a lot better. So he started removing the thymus in other myasthenia gravis patients who didn't have cancer, and he saw that their symptoms also improved.
Oh.
So this hinted at the fact that T cells are playing some sort of role in messing up the acetylcholine signaling. And then after that, there are a couple more discoveries. They found that babies whose mothers had myasthenia gravis would also have transient like episodes of muscle weakness, almost like the mother was transferring something causing the symptoms. And then lastly, in the 1970s, studies were done where mice were injected with antibodies against acetylcholine receptors. and this recapitulated myasthenia gravis symptoms. All of this collectively points to myasthenia gravis being an autoimmune disorder, meaning that the body is attacking acetylcholine signaling in some way.
Mm.
So normally your body is trained, your immune system cells are trained to not recognize and attack things that are part of you.
Right.
But in the case of myasthenia gravis, about 80% of patients, you can find antibodies that they're making that are specific for acetylcholine receptors. So when you're generating antibodies against these receptors, this can block acetylcholine from actually binding to the receptor, but it also leads to destruction of the receptor and even damage of the muscle end plate. No antibodies are detected in about 20% of patients, but currently doctors think that they probably are generating some sort of antibody that interrupts signaling between the neurons and the muscle. They just aren't able to identify it yet. And then if you're secreting antibodies everywhere, this means that all of the muscles are being exposed to this antibody. However, we mentioned that some muscles are more susceptible to the symptoms than others. This is probably because things like your eyes, your face muscles already have lower levels of acetylcholine receptors at the neuromuscular junction. So that means that if you have antibody, they're probably going to bind more of it up, and there's just nowhere for the endogenous signaling to occur. And it's also because your eyes and your facial muscles are actually firing so much that they get fatigued very easily.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we tend to see the eye drooping, the face drooping, the difficulty swallowing and speaking. Obviously, Opechancanough, they didn't know what was going on. They did not have treatments. Today, there are several types of treatments. The first are those acetylcholinesterase inhibitors that I mentioned earlier. And basically what these do is prevent acetylcholine from being broken down, which should keep it hanging out and hopefully producing more signaling. And then there's also immunosuppressant drugs, and removal of the thymus still works. We don't totally know why the thymus seems to be involved in symptoms so much, but in 70% of cases, removal of the thymus does seem to improve symptoms.
Do we not need the thymus?
I mean, you would be immunocompromised,
Okay.
which is actually an important point. So we do have these treatments. However, if you use an immunosuppressant drug or if you remove your thymus, that is going to really leave you at risk for other infections.
Mm-hmm.
So there's actually some studies going on, some clinical trials to try and identify something that's a little bit more targeted. And I thought this was really cool because our very first episode, we talked about Charles VI and schizophrenia. Right. And we talked about another component of the immune system called complement protein. So to remind you or refresh you if you haven't listened to that episode, complement is a whole group of proteins in the immune system that basically tags things for removal or tags things as trash. And complement is actually super relevant to myasthenia gravis. So when the antibodies that a patient is generating bind to acetylcholine receptors, complement gets activated and starts tagging the receptors
That's
to
trash.
get rid of it, get rid of it, get rid of it. And this is what leads to removal of the receptors and also that physical damage to the muscle that I mentioned. So these current clinical trials are studying the efficacy of specific complement inhibitors in myasthenia gravis patients, which would hopefully improve symptoms without leaving them vulnerable to infection and all of the other risks of immunosuppressive therapies.
So let me ask this, and maybe you're going to get to this, or maybe you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the fact that Opechancanough was poisoned, because you mentioned that the study in the 1930s of
Mm-hmm.
was it a plant?
Yeah,
Or
curcumin.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that had those similar effects. Do you think him being poisoned had anything to do with what developed, or is that just like a coincidence?
I intentionally didn't read a lot about Opechancanough ahead of the episode because you told me it was very exciting and I wanted to be surprised.
Yes.
So I didn't actually know that he was poisoned, and I had the same thought when you mentioned it. I doubt that he was poisoned with curare just because it is specific to Central and South America. So I don't think the British would have like
Right.
known to poison him with that.
Yeah.
Um, and also, if he was poisoned with that, he probably would have died. It's pretty lethal.
Yeah.
But
Interesting.
I don't know what they did poison him with. You know, I think we've talked a little bit about crosstalk between the immune system and the nervous system before, and myasthenia gravis, while it's not associated with like a specific virus or bacterial infection, it is known that having like a severe illness can um, lead to the development of symptoms and
Okay.
onset of the disease. So I don't know, it's possible. It's tough because we do have that 7-year gap in like
Right.
all information where he goes off the grid.
Yeah. And to your point, neither of the men that were poisoned died.
Right.
So, like, by some miracle, if Opechancanough somehow survived that, like, plant, the other person probably wouldn't. So it was probably something
I did think it was interesting that
different.
he like lived to be so old and also had such a critical illness when he was in Mexico, because
It's a
myasthenia gravis, like as you can imagine, your immune system is messed up. So
right.
typically they're more susceptible to infections, even if they're not on patients with myasthenia gravis, even if they aren't on therapy,
Right.
immunosuppressive therapy. So I think it is pretty remarkable. He just is a very robust, like
Honestly.
indestructible
Yeah.
person.
Especially because the English and the Spanish and whoever else was visiting was bringing all kinds of
So many
foreign
diseases.
diseases that they couldn't even survive. So my theory is that he had all these travels and it clearly helped him build an immunity
Yeah.
um, to some of these things.
Yeah.
That's just my theory. But
Just a fun fact that I wanted to mention that came up when I was researching Opechancanough is that there is another pretty notable Native American historical figure who also had myasthenia gravis, and that is Wilma Mankiller, who was the first female chief of Cherokee Nation in I think like 1970s ish. She had lived with myasthenia gravis like most of her adult life,
oh wow,
and was an advocate for patients. So just
good for
a
her.
fun coincidence. And I read a little bit about her. She's interesting. If anyone wants to check
Yeah,
her out, Wilma
love it. And
Mankiller,
hopefully
thick
they
name.
had some things to help
Yes.
help her manage it
Mm-hmm.
at that point. Yeah, so awesome. Well, so that again, that's our theory about what ailed Opechancanough towards the end of his life. Again, we don't know what happened when he disappeared for 7 years. There are no records, but what we do know is that there's basically like a power vacuum when he leaves. And so he leaves, and the Powhatans and the neighboring Native American tribes continue to lose more and more land to the English settlers, who are no longer hopeful about the Native Americans' conversion or them living peacefully. So Opechancanough, when he does return, he's like, no, I'm not done fighting. Like, I'm in my 70s or 80s at this point, and we still have work to do. So he orchestrated another attack on the settlers. This time he is captured and he is brought back to Jamestown. Um, and he is eventually shot in the back by one of the guards. It was not to plan. So this is about the mid 1640s, and he's like 100 years old when he dies. It's absolutely incredible. You had mentioned reading about him still having some of these symptoms when he was a prisoner at Jamestown.
Yes.
But it's just fascinating to me that he lived that long, given what we know that he had been through and the places that he had been
Yeah.
since his youth.
It's also just, I mean, zooming out, thinking about that account, like, he had attendants lifting his eyelids for him.
Right.
So that shows you the severity of his illness, but also I think like the power that he wielded.
Right.
Like that, despite the fatigue, despite the weakness, like he was such a leader that
Right.
like throughout history we've seen like any weakness, psychological or otherwise, people like discredit you
Right.
as a ruler, and he was still being carried around on a litter and had people keeping his eyelids open for him so that he could continue to rule.
They were willing to follow him on yet another attack after several had already been thwarted. Some of them, it seemed like they were successful and they were going to get rid of, the English, and then they came back and they came back again. And this was, years and years and years of war, and they were still able to follow him. Unfortunately, after he died, after he was killed, the Native Americans, the Powhatans, and other tribes in that area of Virginia continued to lose more and more ground, as we know. And then, several years after Opechancanoug's death, the Powhatan chiefdom basically is virtually non-existent. So you still have these tribes that existed, but the way that they were together in this power under Chief Powhatan and then Opechancanough, it's never really the same. Today, Opechancanogh's tribe, the Pamunkeys, the people still live on that land of their ancestors. And this one quote from James Horn in the book that I read that I thought was like really powerful, that wrapped up why we wanted to talk about Opechancanough and really the legacy that he had that most people don't know about. He says Opechancanough prevented the expansion of Spanish settlement in North America, and he resisted English settlement on the mid-Atlantic coast for half a century. He came closer than any other warrior of his time to driving them from American shores.
Oh.
So, James Horn is crediting him. When he killed the Jesuits that he was with, he basically tricked them. They didn't really come back. The Spanish didn't come back. And so you think, like, what happens if he hadn't killed them and they had assimilated with the Native Americans, maybe converted some of them? The Spanish, King Philip would have sent more ships, more people. That didn't happen. And then you have the English, as I said, it took them many, many decades to kind of cement Jamestown as a settlement. And they left many times and came back. And, they almost gave up as well. And Opechancanough and Powhatan and those people did not make it easy on them. So they were very close to extinguishing them from that area. And as we know, sadly, that's not how it ended up. But really fascinating to think that that one person had that much influence.
Yeah. One person that I had never heard of, you had never heard of.
Never.
Like, that's really wild to think about.
Yeah. As soon as I was reading and I heard, Pocahontas, Powhatan, I was like, oh, John Smith, I know exactly where we are now in history. But little did we know that there was someone else that was pulling the strings as well.
Yeah.
So hopefully, in the spirit of the wonderful holiday of Thanksgiving, you guys are ready to celebrate and sit down to that turkey dinner thinking of all of the lies that you've been told your whole life.
Yeah.
And you're welcome. That's what I'm thankful for.
This is great turkey dinner fodder.
Yes.
Tell your family everything that you learned. Don't talk about politics. That is messy territory. Just talk about Pocahontas.
It could be political.
Okay, that's true.
It could be political.
But, I mean, if your uncle's getting mad about this, good luck.
Yeah, there was no hope for you anyway.
Another house for Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah,
That's all.
but whatever you do, do not tell your family that we came over on the Mayflower and
No.
we are single-handedly responsible, our family, for the settlement of New England.
But, I mean, we were at the first Thanksgiving.
Yeah, but now I don't even know if that was that real?
I think that one Thanksgiving
that single
meal, yeah, and then it all went left. But
we'll always have that one dinner.
We'll always have Squanto and William Bradford enjoying one meal together, and yeah. So I really don't want to be associated with it, but I kind of do want to be associated with the institution of Thanksgiving.
And may all your Thanksgiving dinners be as peaceful as that. Amen. I'm sick.